Alrighty, this one's a bit of a fun one. So it's obviously made its rounds in the news and everything that's going on in the world at the moment. And I thought it might be about time just to chuck a quick video on and explain how tariffs actually work. Now, what I'm going to do in this video to make it a little bit easier, especially for an Australian audience, is I'm going to explain an example using Australia and USA as an example. Now, for this example, we're going to use kangaroos. All right, it's just going to make it easier. The picture was really easy to find, just make things a lot easier to understand. All right, so you can pretend whatever it is. All right, whether it's wheat or alcohol, fish, whatever you want to pretend it is. So in this case, it's going to be a kangaroo. Now, simply put, tariffs, they're essentially taxes on imported goods. All right, so the country imposing the tariff in this case, for the examples you're going to see coming up, will be the USA. And we're going to use the actual tariffs they're doing. All right, so we're going to use 10% just to make it a little bit more easy to understand. So a tariff is just a tax imposed by the country on a good, all right, or sometimes a service. Now in this case it's a good, and we're going to call that good a kangaroo. Now, if there was no tariffs imposed, if there was an importer in the USA buying kangaroos, and let's pretend the price was $100, that would mean you could buy the kangaroo for $100, and essentially it would end up in the USA now for $100. All right, no tariffs. All right, we're not including things like shipping costs or anything like that. Of course, it'd be expensive to ship a kangaroo, but essentially without tariffs, you buy it for $100 in Australia, you get it for $100 in the USA. Now, with tariffs imposed, and in this example 10%, the $100 kangaroo will still remain $100 in Australia, still cost $100. However, once it gets to the USA, it is going to be $110. And that's really simply explained, okay? The importer is still going to pay that full $110 for the kangaroo, and $10 will be paid as a tariff, 10%. So $10 goes to the office that collects these tariffs, and the importer will pay a total of $110 for that kangaroo, which is actually only $100. Okay, so there's an extra $10. Now, that $10 will obviously go to whichever office, is it the IRS in America, or whatever it might be that collects that $10. But the importer has now paid an increased amount based on this tariff. Okay, before it was $100 with no tariff, now it's $110. So, simply put, now whatever he's using these kangaroos for, let's say he's on-selling them, and previously he would have on-sold them for $110 to get his $10 profit. Now he's going to have to sell it for more to get his profit. So that might be $120. So essentially that's going to increase the price of the kangaroo in the United States. Okay. So ultimately you're probably figuring out pretty fast, well, doesn't this hurt the country? Yes, it can, but there are other things that can happen as well. Okay. So tariffs are actually typically imposed to actually protect local businesses and boost domestic production of something. Okay, whilst also, of course, raising government revenues. Now, essentially, in this example, we can pretend that in America, let's pretend for an example, they had a place that was actually selling kangaroos already for $107. Now, the reason the importer went to Australia was because he could save $7 a kangaroo and buy them just for $100. Okay, without tariffs. So from the importer's view, if the kangaroos are exactly the same in America, the $107 version, versus exactly the same as the Australian version for $100, if there's no difference, this is a business at the end of the day, all right? They're going to go for the cheaper option if it's the exact same thing, okay? So they would have bought them from Australia. Now, in this example, when the tariffs are imposed, that 10%, which will make the import of these kangaroos price increase by 10%, essentially now you're going to have two options. You can still buy them from Australia, but ultimately by the time it actually reaches the US after the tariff has been paid, the total cost will be $110. Now we've got that $107 kangaroo from wherever, where this kangaroo is based. It looks like Texas or wherever that might be in America. Now that $107 kangaroo is looking more attractive because it's $3 cheaper. Okay, so typically, yes, it can sometimes hurt the country imposing it, But if there are other means of production or internally being able to purchase this, when I say internally, within that country that is imposing the tariff, then they'll typically go for domestic alternatives if they can get it for the same or cheaper price, okay, to avoid having to pay that tariff. So now instead of buying it from Australia, they're going to buy it from the US, okay, pay that $107. Still, let's say in this case, obviously it's a bit cheaper, and that's going to obviously increase and boost the economy in many different ways, all right, from people producing the kangaroos all the way along the line, from the people driving it to wherever it goes, etc., etc. Okay, so typically what this will be used for at the end of the day is to correct things like trade imbalances and also encourage prices. Now, when I say encourage prices, now if this importer is no longer importing from Australia because they have to pay that 10% tariff and it costs a bit more at the end of the day, and they can get it cheaper in America, they might continue to buy from that American source for $107. But then Australia might turn around and be like, oh, bugger, no one's buying the kangaroos from us anymore, so they're going to reduce their price. Even though the importer will have to pay that 10% tariff regardless, they might reduce their price to a point where it's still cheaper than buying that $107 one. So for example, they might reduce their price to $90, okay? And then by the time it gets to US, it's $99, etc., etc. All right. Now, that's the simplest, most straightforward, obviously, example I could use, just a kangaroo and these sort of things. But in essence, in a very basic essence, that is how a tariff works. All right. Hope you liked the video. It was a really short video just to give you a better understanding. We're going to go through a lot more detailed videos, but typically what I always say is watch these sort of really basic videos first, then go on to the next step and watch the more difficult videos. Thanks for watching.